Silent Hill: The Short Message, originally released on the 31st of January this year entirely for free on the PlayStation Store, is the first official home console release of a Silent Hill game in just shy of 10 years. Let that sink in for a moment. 10 years. Not a pachinko machine, not a Dead by Daylight DLC package, not a Monsters and Mortals DLC package, and certainly not a godforsaken interactive horror television experience. An actual, fully realized game. And Konami released that game for free. Now, sure, The Short Message is exactly as it sounds. Being a title that barely lasts between 1 to 2 hours, depending on how quickly you power through it, The Short Message is more of a demo than a fully realized game. I may have been overly generous with that description. But considering the outright venomous disregard that a huge portion of the fanbase currently has for the modern era of Silent Hill, releasing this game first, completely free? That's a fascinating decision, and one that feels a whole lot more calculated than it might actually appear. Come August of this year, we will be a full 10 years since the critically acclaimed yet undeniably infamous PT was released, a surprise playable teaser for a brand new installment in the Silent Hill franchise, being led by none other than the legendary Hideo Kojima. But the fun didn't last for very long. Hideo Kojima left Konami, which would then soon lead to the still widely lamented cancellation of Silent Hills. Not only that, Konami's controversial decision to then pull the PT demo from the PlayStation Store, and their continual efforts to copy-strike fan remakes into submission, have struck a particularly nasty chord with the fanbase, who have been left with no other option other than to interpret the publisher's behaviour as little more than the spiteful lashing out of a has-been company with a very bruised ego. And then we fast forward to 2023, and what do we get? Silent Hill Ascension. Which I'm not going to talk about because, let's be honest, you can only beat a dead horse so much before its carcass disintegrates into oblivion. But what I will say, however, is that after the last 10 years, Silent Hill fans have had very good reason to be unhappy, and they have very good reason not to trust Konami. And so with this in mind, The Short Message is clearly the publisher's attempt to mitigate some of that animosity. With an upcoming movie adaptation, new merchandise, and 3 new games on the horizon, one of which being a remake to one of the most influential survival horror games ever made, Konami are desperately hoping that this new generation of Silent Hill is going to win them some nostalgia brownie points, in the vein of Capcom's tremendously successful Resident Evil remakes. Silent Hill F and the Silent Hill 2 remake need to be financially rewarding investments, or this franchise is likely going to be dead in the water once and for all. Konami is a company that prioritizes profits above anything. This is why we have so many pachinko machines, they really like money. And so, after 10 years of dormancy, this new batch of games is probably the last chance we have for Silent Hill. Why else would they have announced so many new projects all in one go? This is the video game equivalent of throwing cooked spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And Ascension might as well have been fresh out the packet and completely dry for how much everyone hated it.
Who the hell thought this looked good?
Releasing The Short Message completely for free is damage control. So let's get to the question that I've been dodging for the past 5 minutes or so. Is The Short Message actually any good?
Why are you chasing me?
First off, let's summarize what this game is actually going for in terms of its characters and setting. You take control of Anita, a teenage girl who inexplicably finds herself transported to an abandoned villa located in the fictional city of Kettenstadt, Germany. Not Silent Hill. this will be the first red flag for many fans of this series. To be honest though, the fact this game doesn't take place in the literal town of Silent Hill doesn't really bother me as much as it might have done maybe a decade ago. We've had a lot of Silent Hill games take place within our favourite haunted little town, but when it comes to creative freedom, forcefully adhering to that particular tick box can be undeniably restrictive. It would be a bit like every Resident Evil game taking place within the mansion. There's only so much you can do with it. Hell, even way back in Silent Hill 3, upon returning to the town as Heather and walking down the exact same streets as James once did in the previous game, it was kind of hard not to recognize how overly familiar it all felt. It was nice to go back, but it also felt like a bit more of the same thing that we'd already had. This is exactly why we got Silent Hill 4 The Room, a game which barely features the eponymous town, if even at all. In a 2005 post-mortem article via the Game Informer magazine, Team Silent stated the following: "Even though the Silent Hill 4 project was a proper sequel to the Silent Hill series, our top objective for the game was change. Creative freedom was always at the forefront of Team Silent's approach to the franchise." So to now fast forward to the short message, developed by Hexadrive, a Japanese company mostly known for HD remasters of other people's games, some involvement in recent Final Fantasy titles, and perhaps most notably of all, a DLC package for Resident Evil 7, the fact that this game doesn't actually take place in the town of Silent Hill is an entirely forgivable aspect to its overall design. Especially as, again similar to The Room, this game almost entirely takes place indoors. In terms of its environmental presentation, there's certainly some clear homage to the classic era of this franchise. Most rooms you set foot into are full to the brim with little details, be it either the enlarged variety of graffiti on the walls, some of which can be genuinely striking, the sneaky inclusion of a classic Silent Hill map, an abandoned rec room with art supplies scattered all over the place, or the dilapidated apartments with filth and grime everywhere and wallpaper being on the verge of peeling away. From an environmental design point of view, the short message is hitting all the right notes for this franchise. These rooms are believable lived-in spaces. It's a really good starting point. And so, back into Anita's shoes we go. She's looking for a friend by the name of Maya, a graffiti artist whose work has garnered a considerable social media following due to its focus on transforming the scars of youth into something beautiful, namely cherry blossoms. The flowers represent the girls overcoming past traumas, or at least their desire to do so. But hey, hang on a sec, you'll have also likely zeroed in on a particularly stigmatized phrase in that last paragraph, which you maybe weren't expecting to show up in your Silent Hill game. Social media. If you hadn't noticed from the title glitch effect on the game's logo or the immediate emphasis on the main character wielding a smartphone torch instead of a flashlight, we're focusing on a very modern iteration of this world, with mentions of the coronavirus pandemic now officially being included in Silent Hill lore, and technology playing its part considerably more frequently than in previous installments. Sure, the use of a radio and a flashlight was a technological factor of the early 2000s, but smartphones tend to come across with an inherently gimmicky aesthetic by comparison to the more rustic handheld radio. Maybe I'm romanticizing things a little bit too much here, but there's something so isolating about a character stuck in a horror scenario with nothing more than a simple flashlight. Whereas with all the bells and whistles of a smartphone, therein lies an immediate disillusionment of the tension. It's hard to take a main character swinging around an iPhone nearly as seriously, but it does at least tie in with the game's focus on a more immature protagonist and some of the game's overall themes, which we'll discuss in just a moment. As can be seen from a text message, Maya tells Anita to meet her in the abandoned villa, where the majority of her graffiti art can be found scattered throughout the building. However, as mentioned previously, it turns out that Anita's actual arrival was a somewhat unexpected one, but she soon gets to work searching for Maya, and in doing so we learn a lot about her relatively quickly. Where Heather Mason of Silent Hill 3 seemingly couldn't give a damn about what people thought of her, the main character of Short Message is the complete opposite. She's self-conscious and suffers from low self-esteem. She's overly critical of her own worth or ability. And most telling of all, she's blatantly envious of Maya's artistic talents and popularity that comes as a result of that.
Everyone can see how talented she is. I couldn't be more different.
Not only that, you do soon come into contact with visual representations and collectible documents that highlights many of the short message's most key subjects, some of which being mental health, bullying, and child abuse. At multiple points, the concept of mental health is touched upon again and again, either through finding a vial of antidepressants, or the topic being mentioned via text message, and so on. Alongside this, the main character's low self-esteem had already been indicated to be a pretty obvious theme of the game via its leaked images all the way back in 2021, so this won't be a surprise to anyone who saw the news about it. Thankfully, they did decide to swap out the word minger and the phrase "I hate myself" with a few less ham-fisted offerings, but the fact remains that when coupled with the issue of bullying, resentment for another person's popularity, or the hostile relationship that can occur between parents and children, we're dealing with an assortment of very childhood to teenager oriented topics here. And yet, with that being said, these are all perfectly relevant topics for the state of the world we live in today. Youthful insecurity in a digital world is a problem that only seems to be getting worse. The blatant pandemic of craving attention and recognition via social media, combined with the desperation for acceptance and validation being amplified a millionfold by the tools so readily available to us. It's an issue that platforms such as TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and yeah, YouTube only serves to exacerbate. And sure, you might be wondering why I'm talking about this so much in a goddamn Silent Hill video. Well, it's because the game's entire plot is hinged on everything that I've just mentioned, which might seem a tad insignificant when compared to, let's say, James searching for his dead wife, or Harry and Heather Mason handling a problem that could result in the end of the world. Sure, that's a perfectly viable point of view, but the fact that Anita's story is far smaller and more personal in scale isn't necessarily a negative. Even with this being the case, it stays relatively close to a number of core Silent Hill ideas, namely guilt and seeking forgiveness, acceptance of one's actions, and the punishment of one's sins. Which is why this happens. It soon becomes apparent that Anita is to blame for something, apologizing to an unknown person during a flashback that takes place in a bathroom. I've blurred this particular scene out in case it might be overly sensitive material for anyone watching, but I'm sure the majority of you can infer what's happening here. Coupled with the half-hearted assertion that her mother loved her, the ongoing use of antidepressants, and a suggestion that she might even need therapy, Anita is clearly experiencing a tremendous level of emotional pressure, which only intensifies all the more when the game reveals its initial twist. If you didn't want spoilers for this game, now is the time to go play it. You good? Okay.
I guess I haven't accepted Maya's death yet.
Huh?
Why did she jump from the villa? Why did she have to die?
Maya's dead? How could I forget that?
Are you alright, Anita? Hello? Hello?
Maya is dead, having thrown herself from the rooftop of the abandoned villa. As it turns out, the building has garnered something of a reputation for similar incidents, and as the weight of this particular revelation settles on Anita's shoulders, she soon finds herself once again being chased by the Cherry Blossom monster. After fleeing from the monster, Anita then arrives at the rooftop to discover Maya's final mural, surrounded by flowers left by those paying tribute to her loss. Following a moment of contemplation on the belief that no one will ever notice Anita, she reasons that perhaps she can be like Maya after all. Perhaps leaving this world in the same way that Maya did would bring her closer to her. The game comes to a close with Anita standing on the roof, before stepping forwards into empty nothingness. Her phone lights up, now heavily cracked on the floor, the game's advisory splash screen on seeking help flashes up one more time, and the game ends. Except it doesn't.
Am I back at the villa? But why didn't I die?
This is where the short message gets legitimately interesting. Anita's death isn't accepted. She is rewound back to her original position in much of the same way that occurs whenever you're killed by the cherry blossom monster. It's a really intriguing idea and one that legitimately caught me off guard the first time I saw it. But unfortunately, it's also where the game's flaws really do start to show.
This is all your fault! Bad things happen because of you!
Up until this point, I've remained mostly neutral on the game's overall quality, but we're now going to delve into some of that. First off, the cherry blossom monster design is really nicely executed. Masahiro Ito returns to provide the concept art and monster design, and it absolutely shows. The stuttering missing frames effect as it walks towards you is eerily unnerving. It may be the one and only monster in this game, but it's a damn good one. As for the sound design and music, Team Silent's own Akira Yamaoka also returns to provide the game's soundtrack. And while I can't say it holds a candle to Yamaoka's finest work, it's still relatively fine overall. The main menu theme and ending credits are nicely put together, as are some of the interim tracks that play throughout the game. If there's one thing that does really capture the atmosphere of a Silent Hill experience throughout the short message, aside from the brief moment you step outside to see the gorgeously foggy exterior and massive otherworldly hole in the street, its soundtrack would be it. And hey, speaking of the otherworld, there's one more thing I can absolutely compliment. The short message's gorgeous realization of Silent Hill's most infamous nightmare. Be it the way the wallpaper peels away to reveal the franchise's signature rusty aesthetic, the eerie incorporation of fencing throughout its earlier chapter, or the hellish combination of figures bound in barbed wire with photos and insults all splattered across the walls, the short message's presentation of the otherworld is legitimately well realized. Okay, that's the good stuff. Now let me tell you what isn't so good. For starters, the story isn't really treading any new ground for this series, even with the inclusion of more modern themes. In particular, this game is absolutely drawing heavy influence from the second installment of the franchise. With clunky dialogue here and ham-fisted "it's all your fault" there, we find ourselves haphazardly James Sunderlanding around until Anita's big bad decision is revealed. Which admittedly is tragic in nature and ultimately results in the death of a friend for reasons that I'm sure many a teenager could find potentially relatable, but it also feels rather clumsily executed. Anita, having felt threatened at the prospect of Maya stealing a close friend away from her, is revealed to have eventually given in to her jealous streak and decided to send an extremely hurtful letter to Maya, in which she expresses her frustrations. "This is all your fault. You stole my only friend. I fucking hate you." It quickly turns really nasty, with Anita abusing Maya with everything she can think of, criticizing her art, telling her she ruined everything, calling Maya a freak. It's an extraordinarily spiteful outpour, which Maya unfortunately completely takes to heart. Having been revealed in flashbacks to be extensively bullied and even being labeled a witch, the letter is the final straw, and Anita's words directly lead to her jumping from the roof of the villa. It's a genuinely heartbreaking outcome, caused by little more than a teenager's momentary spell of immature madness. So why does this feel clumsy? Well, it's because the way the game tells you its story has about as much subtlety as a brick.
Slut!
as for the game in general, when everything is considered, the short message really isn't all that memorable either. The monster chases get old really quickly. The story doesn't grab you with anywhere close to the emotional depth that it really needs, especially considering how reliant the short message is on it. The game's insistence on interrupting its own gameplay with a text conversation is outright infuriating, which also ties into the fact that Anita isn't all that likable as a protagonist either. It's hard to root for her even at the best of times, and it feels like the developers knew this, and so at the very end of the game decided to shove in a really tragic example of child abuse to justify her behavior. We didn't really need that. Sometimes people just do stupid things. Sometimes when we're young and immature, we make bad decisions. And learning from those decisions can be really impactful experiences. And I have to say, the looping environments are undeniably very PT, which is a surefire way to piss off a select portion of the fanbase who are still very bitter to this day. So, while I can't say I dislike the short message, I also don't particularly like it either. I appreciate the desire to try something a little different, with members of the team such as Yamaoka himself vouching for the project with clear enthusiasm. But when I think back to my time with this game, having spent close to 4 hours slowly combing through it, taking step by step as gradually as I could to make sure that I get the most out of this game, I don't actually remember much of it, which is arguably the game's greatest failing. I will probably never play this game again, because I don't recall any reason to. The short message is fine for a free Silent Hill experience. It has some genuinely good elements, but ultimately it's also an entirely forgettable one. And that's my final thought on this game. I'd like to thank my wonderful supporters on Patreon for their continued support, in particular the highest tiers: Game Master, Dark Raptor 86, BFD Survivor, and Shikotsky. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you on the next video.